Hi, thanks for listening. Welcome to the Power Hungry podcast, where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today it's going to be a lot about politics and some about energy too. My guest is Joel Kotkin. Joel is he has a long resume. You're the author, Joel, of 10 books. Is that right?
Yes.
10 books, editor of several others.
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about Joel's new book. It's The Coming of NeoFeudalism. A warning to the global middle class. I've just finished reading it. It came out in May.
Yes.
And Joel, I could go on and blather around about your resume and who you are, but what I've found is fun is to have my guests introduce themselves. So just act as though you've just arrived at a dinner party and met someone you don't know. Introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
Well, usually I ask my wife to do it because I don't like doing it myself.
Well, Mandy's not here.
That's right. Basically, I consider myself a journalist. I've done a lot of history. One of the reasons I'm having such a hard time with the current atmosphere is I was brought up with the idea that journalists, and I think the same thing could be true for historians, their job was to tell the truth as best as they could and to elucidate things. And now journalism is being turned into something that would be more akin to Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia. It is
wow. Now
it is
we're getting off to a roaring start here, Mr. Kotkin.
It's become a tool to present a certain ideology and a certain kind of orthodoxy. Now, the great thing is that we're still a free country and there's pushback. Americans, even those who are on the left, particularly of my generation, are very hostile to the idea that there is such a thing as one set of truths that can't be challenged. And that's really what we're seeing. And that's true for climate, it's true for energy, it's true for Black Lives Matter. It's something that we really, it's gender issues. The idea that there is an orthodoxy is so objectionable to me. And it's so terrible that it's strongest in the very institutions, academia, media, and even the entertainment industry, which should be the most skeptical and poking the most fun at accepted ideas.
So rather than the heterodoxy or of opinion, you got this orthodoxy, I guess. So, well, wait, I'm going to interrupt here. So are you finished introducing yourself then?
Yeah.
So you consider yourself a journalist, that's been your career then?
I'm a writer. One of the terrible things about the sort of credentialism that we have today is that the idea that somebody makes his living or her living as a writer is not sufficient. You have to have, 3 graduate degrees, and you have to, which, tends to mean that you do follow a certain orthodoxy. The people that I consider my great role models, none of them had much to do with universities. You think about people like de Tocqueville, or for that matter, Marx or Nietzsche or any of the really interesting writers. They were all kind of self-taught people who, learned things out in the world and then made their conclusions. What we have now is something very much like a credential society where you have to have this credential to say anything. So even a really brilliant analyst, like I was just talking to Mike Schellenberger, he gets taken off the Facebook page and the page on Forbes because some of the scientists disagree. Well, scientists are supposed to disagree. Right. By the way, I was brought up in a scientific environment. My father taught at a medical school. He was very much a sort of person with a scientific orientation. I'm not hostile to it at all. I just think that I always think of this line from my father, who died many years ago. He said, who killed the most people in history? He said, doctors, because we thought something was true and it turned out not to be true. Whether you go back to using leeches and bleeding people in the 17th century, or some of the treatments that we had. Look, we can tell just with the COVID situation that some of the initial therapies were the exact wrong thing.
And
But
putting
that's
people in
just
nursing homes was the exact wrong thing to do, because that became one of the biggest death zones
probably the
for
biggest by
yeah,
far.
42% according to published work by Free Up, and the New York Times has published the same. So, okay, so you're against credentialism, and you're a journalist, but you also have credentials with Chapman University, and you do have an academic home. But we didn't necessarily, I wanted to just kind of establish your bona fides here at the top to talk about your background and where you're coming from. But you've been writing about class for a long time,
Yes.
and that's at the root, really, of this book. I mean, it's really fundamentally a book about class and the growing class divide. So, tell me, why is that so important to you? I mean, you were born and raised in New York, is that right?
Yes.
In the what part of New York?
Well, I grew up initially in Brooklyn, and then we moved to Long Island. Um, and I was very aware of the class issue in part because my father came from a middle class background, but self-made um, man, clothing manufacturer, big surprise. Um, and but my mother came from working class. My grandmother was a seamstress, and my grandfather was a window washer.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I was always very aware of there being these class divisions. And then as I began to study, I thought the great thing that was happening in the United States historically was that people could move up in the class system. This is what was behind, the growth in Europe, also in Japan, and even up until recently in China. This was the great positive story. What I was noticing as I started writing, particularly about younger people, is that chance, that idea of upward mobility, that if I work hard and I have good idea, I can make it into the middle or the upper middle class. That is diminishing. And the type of society we have, and to describe it as, there are really two ascendant classes. One is what I call the oligarchs, mostly the tech companies, the very same people who are now censoring the Michael Schellenbergers of the world, and I'm sure they'll get around to us at some point, maybe if we make a big enough wave. Um, who are basically now controlling the media. The scary thing about the oligarchs is not just that they have money, and not just that they control big companies, is that they have control of the means of information. I
Well,
didn't have a,
let me interrupt if you don't mind, because you've used that term a lot, the oligarchs, and I'm not going to quibble with you about it, but it's one that in my ear sounds, well, that's what you hear about Russia, right? Not the United States, right? But you're bringing that term into the American discourse, and is it fair? I mean, I put that, just as a straight question,
sure.
is it as a fair comparison?
I think it's very fair because if you think about the oligarchs in Russia, they were people who were in the bureaucracy, who were positioned to take control of state-owned enterprises. It's a different story in the U.S. The public, the Defense Department, basically developed the internet. It was initially seen as sort of an open forum that anybody can have. But what we see, just like the barbarians who took over the land after the Roman Empire, a group of companies came in and were able to pretty well monopolize almost every major niche of the tech economy. That makes them oligarchs. When you have 80-90% control over search, if you control the vast majority of revenues in online advertising, if you control a vast proportion of social media, if you have the operating systems for phones, and these companies are no longer competitive companies. They are more like utilities in some senses. And what's happened is, initially, I started covering Silicon Valley in 1975, when it was not even quite known as Silicon Valley. What was great about it is it was a bunch of engineers wanted to solve problems. And those problems varied, including how do you send a capsule to space and to the moon. That was a very positive culture, but they didn't try to control how we thought, what we thought, what
or
what what
what we saw, because they didn't have the capability.
right. And that wasn't probably their inclination. But now we have a very defined elite class, and it's the tech oligarchs are at the top. But what's interesting is how many of them work for other tech oligarchs. How many of the venture capital funders are the same venture capital funders who have funded other companies? And then the private equity guys who are kind of, in Maoist terms, we would call them running dogs of the venture capitalists. So they put in huge amounts of money. You know, I was in the venture capital business briefly, and what I learned very quickly is really it wasn't about talent or ideas. It was about who had money.
Uh-huh.
Somebody with the same idea as Mark Zuckerberg, but was not connected to that network, would never get hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. So what you've got now is kind of this sort of charmed circle of people who dominate everything. That's why the tech economy is based in two places: the Bay Area and the Seattle area. You know, everybody else, you know, it fights for the scraps that are left over.
But
And
those are,
then,
but let me interrupt you, because that's the part that I have the quote here when you talk about the oligarchs. You have a chapter in the book called "The Oligarchs." You say the tech oligarchs tend to regard themselves as more enlightened and progressive than their industrial era predecessors. And I thought about that. Well, okay, yeah, I'm sure that's likely true, but it is all. But in terms of their politics, with the exception of maybe Peter Thiel, I mean,
right,
who among those ones that we can name, how many of them are conservatives or would consider themselves on the right? I would say less than. I mean, I could count them on one hand if I had, you know, I don't know, Thiel, who else is there, right? But they regard themselves as politically liberal, and yet if I could say broadly about your book, you're saying no, they're not liberal at all, because they're constraining the flow of information and constraining the flow of capital. Is that a fair
yeah,
assessment?
yes, but you have to. How do you define being liberal? They
Yeah.
may
Okay.
define being liberal or progressive, which is
Okay,
the
or
term.
leftist, I guess. I've been called out on the liberal label before, but they're on the left, right,
Right,
and
and
associated with the Democratic Party, not the Republicans.
overwhelmingly,
And the
and
same
I
is
think
true of
they're
reporters. You point this out in the book as well. That was it. 93% of journalists identify as Democrats, not Republicans.
and of course the academia is the same way. I mean, what you have is you have a conventional wisdom that people just are going to go along with.
And
And
this is
part of it is,
particularly true when it comes to climate change, energy policy.
yes,
Right.
climate change, energy policy, gender, transgender, any of these major issues. Jeff Bezos is now, who was not this way, I think, initially, is very progressive, except when you start talking about taking his money. Then all of a sudden he becomes a little bit more protective. That's why they hated Bernie Sanders,
Right.
because, you know, Bernie, in his 2016 campaign, was very, very explicit on this. So what you have is the idea that if you create a progressive regime which regulates everything, if you already have yours, that's great shape. The person who is going to have a hard time under the current and emerging sort of progressive regime is going to be the independent. Well, you don't have enough women, you don't have enough African Americans, you don't have enough Latinos, you know, you didn't meet this climate goal and you didn't meet that climate goal. Oh, you put your business where your engineers want to live. Oh, no, but that means they have to get in their cars and go to work. We'd much rather they lived in a loft in you know, in lower Manhattan, because that would be more approved. I mean, so what you've got is you've got the more barriers you put up from the state, the better it is for the oligarchs, unless you did
Because
antitrust.
they have the lobbyists, they have the lawyers, they have the ability to maintain the. I guess a different way I'd put it is this gigantism has taken over, and that seems to be accelerating, particularly under COVID. Scott Adams said
Yes,
something recently about this was a month or more ago now, where the rioting was happening, and there you saw these retail shops being the windows being busted and everything, you know, putting aflame. And he said, "Oh, this is great for Bezos, right? This is like the perfect scenario for Amazon, because people aren't going to be able to go shopping. The only way they can get it is through the mail."
well, and of course it's also going to be very bad for cities, because people are not going to want to go into them. And, you know, I mean, what's interesting is that the progressive positions very often work against their own interests. But on the class struggle, you have this oligarchical group who are perfectly happy with a regulatory state that really is,
works to their benefit.
and we have to remember that Obama and Bush both basically punted on antitrust. When Microsoft has 90% market share on operating systems, don't you think that's a problem? Don't you think that we get afflicted with mediocre software? Because what do they care? I mean, they have overwhelming numbers. Then you add to that the control of content. That's the big thing, because what they've done is they've bought the Washington Post, they've bought the New Republic, they've bought the Atlantic. Bloomberg, in a way, is another kind of oligarch, even though he's an old guy, but he's in the same mold.
Controls a major media platform.
I mean, basically, you've got 5 or 6 media companies, only one of which, Fox or News Corp, is at all dissenting on any of these issues. So
let me interrupt you there, because I mean, you brought up cities, and that's one of the things. I've got a long list of questions and things we could talk about. I don't know how much time you have. I'm planning on 5 or 6 hours here. You cleared your calendar. Well, okay, so let's talk about the politics part of it, because you and I have known each other for a while. How do you define your politics?
I would say my politics are traditional, sort of Truman, Pat Brown, social democratic politics. I would say that's how I would look at myself. I've never been able.
Your history is in the left.
Much more on the left. I would say, who were my early mentors? One was Michael Harrington, who wrote The Other America and later was head of the Socialist Party of America. And then my other was Allard Lowenstein, who was really the inventor of the Dump Johnson movement, actually, in 1968. So,
but you consider yourself of the left, and yet you write for the Orange County Register. You write for City Journal. I mean, the outlets in which you're being published are
now we're getting. This is a good.
Of them on the right. So this is speaking to kind of your own history, but also the funnel, the media funnel, about what's allowed or what's accepted as in polite society. I'll put it that way.
I could write a piece for Brian Anderson at City Journal, or Rich Lowry at National Review, or Claire Lehman over at Quillette, all of whom you would think would be considered somewhat conservative, because they like a diversity of ideas. There are libertarians, there are Trumpistas, and there are all other voices. The problem is, on the left, it's increasingly homogeneous views. And this is where the other class, that there are 2 ascendant classes. One is the oligarchs, and the other one are the clerisy. And they are the ones who supply the content to the oligarchs so that they are able to impose the orthodoxy, so that you can get a credentialed scientist who says you got to take Mike Schellenberger's articles out, even if Schellenberger can have 5 other scientists who agree with him.
So let me interrupt you again. I'm good at this, interrupting. But you mentioned now in your book, you talk about the 3 different castes, right? You have the oligarchy, you have the clerisy, and the yeomanry. So we pretty much covered the oligarchy, and the clerisy is the educated class, the academics, and journalists is the kind of the broad. But the yeomanry, and I'm skipping around here in no particular order in the questions as I wrote them, but I thought your section on the rise of Holland and the Dutch, and what the Dutch, where did I made some notes on that about the rise of Holland, and you described how they broke out. Here, I marked it in my book here, but it was about, I know what it was. You said that in 1650 in Amsterdam, 1/3 of the population was foreign born, but it was about Holland and the Netherlands being able to essentially restrain the power of the church and restrain the power of the kings, so that they made way for the middle class, for the yeomanry. And I thought that's a fascinating bit of history. I knew about the rise, of course, of the Netherlands as a trading hub. But tell me, I'll put it to, so why was that so important? And you really define it as that mid 1600s change and the rise of the yeomanry. Is that a fair assessment of what you have?
Well, one of the big things is that they were creating new land as they were reclaiming from the sea. So there were new places for people to go. I mean, what made America and Canada and Australia the kind of places they became is that there was land, there was places for people to go. Later on, it became the
so
move
they could
to the
become
suburbs.
property owners.
But property owners, the key issue for democracy, Barrington Moore, the great radical, may I add, social scientist said, no bourgeois, no democracy. And I think that that's the essence. If the next generation is made up of renters who are dependent on subsidies, who probably won't have kids, will never own a business,
then they don't have a stake. They don't have a stake,
and
they don't have a stake in the society, and that's that seems to me to the core of your argument there. That particularly in California,
right? And this leads to this fourth class, which is growing, which is I call the serf class, which are people who will never own anything. Are maybe they'll work in the gig economy a little bit. Maybe they'll they'll do some personal service, maybe they'll do some illegal stuff, but the serf class is what happens when the yeomanry stop growing. The goal of a democratic society should be, how do we take the people at the bottom, move them into the yeoman class, become property owners, or their children become property owners. Now the clerisy and the oligarchs aren't interested in that. What they really want is a sort of pliant group of people. I remember one time I was speaking actually with Bjorn Lundberg at an environment conference at the Wall Street Journal had in Santa Barbara, and I was sitting next to a venture capitalist. I said, well, the young people, they don't have kids, they don't see any future. He said, well, we don't really need people. We'll just have robots, and then we'll have, my children who will program the robots. I mean, this is like
who will pay the programmers who fix the robots. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, the Morlocks and the Eloi. I mean, this. And what's interesting when you read Greg Ferenstein's interviews with tech, particularly internet tech people, they don't believe in upward mobility. They think that power is going to go to a small class of in quote talented people, just like them, and they're going to have to figure out, okay, how much do we have to give to keep the peasants from putting us on their pitchforks? I mean, that's like what we see with this pandering to Black Lives Matter, which is, I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying they're basically Maoists. Their politics are way to the left. I went to Berkeley. I know.
So now, when you're referring to, you said they are Maoists. About whom are
Black
you talking?
Lives Matter.
Okay.
I mean, they're basically Maoists. They want a cultural revolution. They want to racialize everything in this country, which would completely destroy the promise that Dr. King and Frederick Douglass were talking about, and sort of inverting it into a racial regime where if somebody is Latino or particularly African American, they get put into a different category. But instead of historically having been discriminated against, they get discriminated for. This doesn't at all affect the position of the oligarchy or the clerisy. They're still on top, but what they do is they use these kinds of political steps to sort of mobilize support for their positions. And we see this particularly when we look at issues like climate change. We work here in California. The media is completely, totally bought in. You cannot, whether it's the pandemic or climate change, there's only one interpretation, and that interpretation is, sort of, Greta Thunberg. The world's coming to an end, and if all you middle and working class people would just stop driving cars and working in factories or buying stuff, the world would be a better place. Now, of course, it wouldn't be. It would be kind of a miserable place, but this is the orthodoxy. So that what you have is they are able to pick issues that they can endorse that don't really hurt them. You don't have a lot
and can help them, in fact, build a bigger moat around their businesses.
And of course, and then to participate in this sort of bit of a fraud on renewable energy, which Schellenberger and others, and Michael Moore even, have pointed out that this is incredibly expensive energy. And I'll give you an interesting example that I'm working on right now. California wants to make electric trucks mandatory by 2024. Well, that's basically going to wipe out an entire class, predominantly Latino immigrants, who drive trucks into the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and in Oakland, because electric trucks are unproven, they're expensive, they'd have to go and buy them. And because of the shift to renewables, we're going to go all electric, but the price of electricity is going to go through the roof.
So the price of electricity in California is already going through the roof.
And so what we're finding is what the Greens are pushing now is, what could we ask them? Say, okay, if we have all electric cars, all electric trucks, then they're not emitting anything. So why is it bad if people drive? It turns out that because they know that under the renewable regime, even if we destroy half the Central Valley with these horrendous plants that they want to build, the price of energy is going to be so high that it will not be economic for people to drive.
Well, you make a point of this in several parts in the book, where you talk about the climate change rhetoric and the issue of energy as a way that, in fact, the oligarchs then help build a bigger moat, right? That they keep the yeomanry down. You said that,
and they also invest in these things so they can't lose money on them because they're all subsidized.
Right. You said that the policy around climate change, here's the quote, tightened the alliance between the clerisy and the oligarchs, and that many of the climate policies, again, quoting, are directly injurious to the middle class and working class by inflating energy and housing prices, for example, or by stifling industrial development.
Right.
I mean, you're really talking about your adopted state of California. But this has really become accepted there, and that some among the highest prices for motor fuel, among the highest prices for electricity, and then you recently did a report for Chapman University on the vehicle miles traveled tax, which is effectively a new form of tax on mobility, which I didn't quite understand until I read your report. But how does you're one of California's biggest critics now? What can happen? And California's long been in the vanguard of policy and politics in America. What's the fundamental problem there? How has California gotten so far afield from what was a place where middle class America was thriving?
Well, part of the problem has been demographics. As the state has become more regulated, more high taxed, limited in what economic activities can be done, it's lost a lot of its middle class. The group that's leaving the most, young families, people in their 30s and 40s, people like me who got here early, bought my first house in Hollywood for $150,000. I've been riding that inflationary elevator, very successfully, I guess.
Because you were able to buy property.
Right. I was able to buy property in 1980. Try to buy property now. If I take a look at me circa 1980 you I'd be lucky to have a studio apartment. So that
because you just couldn't afford to buy a house.
No, I couldn't even think about buying a house. I can tell you, when I meet with my students, almost none of them think they're going to be able to stay in California. It's just a question, they might, hang out in LA for a couple of years, but if in terms of getting married, having a family, buying a house, that they can't do this here. So the sociological base of California changed. What was left of the middle class, and particularly the working class, was Hispanic. The Republicans managed to completely alienate that population, even though many Latinos are more conservative on social policy, believe in hard work, believe in like to start businesses, all those
strong families, stay married,
very strong families,
religiously conservative.
But the problem is that the Republicans were so ham-handed. They didn't realize that the world of 2000 was not the same world as 1980. So you alienated them. Then you had the takeover of the education system. So even Asians who do well in the education system are basically cajoled in the education system to identify with discrimination against themselves. My ethnic group, I'm Jewish, probably among the number of Jews who actually favor and will favor affirmative action being placed. You sit there and you say, how could you possibly favor that? This means, we were talking with my daughter who inherited my father's, dark skin. My father was, more looked Turkish, because my family is from the Black Sea, at least parts of it. And we were saying, maybe we can find some Sephardic genes in my daughter. So maybe we can play that. The whole idea that if somebody happens to have descendants who came from Spain, which a lot of Jewish people do.
Yeah.
Well, why does that privilege me in any way, shape, or form? And why should the daughter of a woman whose grandfather was killed in the concentration camps be discriminated against? I mean, what where is the justice there? So I mean, I think that what you've got is this desire on the part of the clerisy to basically racialize absolutely everything. And the oligarchs, as long as somebody says, well, you know what, Jeff, I think you should step down as chairman and give up your 190 billion or whatever it is you have, and put a person of color in that position. And by the way, I find the whole notion, person of color, as somebody who's written a lot about immigration, person of color? Are you telling me that how about an immigrant from Africa? Africans are doing fine in this country, generally speaking. Are they people of color? Are they being discriminated against? By the way, what about Indians, many of whom are also very dark? What about all the different kinds of Hispanics who come from different cultures with different...
So we're going to have the race test will be some kind of I don't know, like the chlorine, remember the pool, you test the water and the chlorine in the pool to see if you're dark enough, then there's a sliding scale or something. So, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up, because you also mentioned the book, and I've got so many bookmarks here, but you talk at one point, I'm trying to find it, about the reaction to neo-feudalism has rather than a reaction against the oligarchs, has been one that's been a reaction against immigrants, against people of color. And it's been, I would say, the way I would read that would be some of the staunch Trump supporters, right? And white, low-income white residents in rural areas, right? That instead of looking at the oligarchs and looking at the owners of the factory that sent it to Mexico, they're saying, oh, well, it's because of the black and brown people. I'm paraphrasing what you said in the book, but is that a fair assessment of what you said?
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why, as much as I don't think the Biden administration will be very successful in any of these addressing the serious problems, I think you have to get Trump out of the picture, because if the Republican Party is going to become a working class, middle class party, it has to be an inclusive party. You can't there aren't enough old white folks around to sustain anything close to a political majority.
Right.
We should look at California as a cautionary tale of what happens when the two-party system is destroyed, because between wealthy liberals, the oligarchs, the Greens, the public employees, and then you've got all the Hispanic and African American people who themselves are the biggest victims of these policies, but sign on to them because this is what the media tells them. This is what their political leadership. I'll give you a great absurd example.
Sure.
One of the biggest advocates of extreme climate change policy is a man named De Leon. He was
Kevin De Leon, former Senate Majority Leader.
He represents East LA, which is one of the greatest victims of deindustrialization and the collapse of the education system of any part of California, one of the poorest districts. How the hell does expensive energy, for instance, or policies that create very high-priced housing, how does that benefit that constituency? I don't think it does. So,
but that's part of the orthodoxy, right? Because that's the way Democrats in California are supposed to talk about these things.
Right, and then of course what you do is you then you say, oh yeah, I'm in favor of, I always find this interesting. Like, I'm against population growth, but I'm in favor of open borders. Um, because I think the oligarchs want their supply of cheap labor, whether it's nannies or gardeners or cleaning people, all of whom are important. But at the same time, they also want to import H-1B visa people,
Right.
or who are cheap skilled labor. So yes,
Well, let me interrupt here again, because the California part of this to me is really interesting, because I remember we talked about this. In fact, I looked at my notes. We talked in 2017, and you talked about the conflict this way. You said it's a war between the digital and the material, San Francisco versus Houston, right?
Yes.
And it seemed, and I used that analogy several years ago when I was talking about Texas, and right, what is the model going to be for American governance? Is it going to be the Texas model of smaller government, no personal income taxes, other things, but right, but starting from this idea of smaller government, or is it going to be the California model? But when I look at California today compared to what I wrote that book 15 or 16 years ago, I see a state that really is starting to fray and really come apart in many ways because of the enormous homeless problem. And you said, I don't know that this is exact wording in your book, but you wrote this in a recent article. You said, rather than the vanguard of a more egalitarian future, California has become the progenitor of a new form of feudalism, characterized by gross inequality and increasingly rigid class lines, a trend that could be exacerbated in the aftermath of the coronavirus outbreak. So, two questions: can California change in a way quickly enough to kind of stop this flight of people out? And then second, talk about the everything's about COVID now. What are we going to see after that? But California, if you were Senate majority leader in the California legislature, what would you be pushing? What would be the policies you'd be enacting there?
Well, I mean, some of it's really absurd, particularly if you want to look at the pandemic. What we know very clearly is that not necessarily just infections, but if you look at fatalities, high density areas dependent on transit have way out of proportion to anyone else, even with all the talk of surges in Arizona and Texas and even here in California. In reality, it's 8-1, 10-1, 15-1, depending on the state. The number of people who die from this, and that has a lot to do with what we call exposure density. If you're you're on a subway, or if you're in a crowded housing. So what I would be proposing, not that anyone would ever elect me, but even Californians are not that crazy. But I think that what I would be saying is, one, okay, what are we doing now? We're basically telling people that they need to take transit. We're going to spend a fortune, $25 billion on transit in LA, and there's fewer people riding it now than in 1980, okay, or 1990. So you're pushing exactly the opposite. What we should be pushing for is dispersion, having jobs where people can afford to live. Like, for instance, the current plans in California would disadvantage the Inland Empire and the Central Valley for jobs and housing, and force everything on the coast, which are incredibly expensive. Right. So you're not going to solve the affordable housing problem. You're certainly, the only housing you're going to build is either going to be subsidized. It's going to be 1-bedroom and studio apartments. So it's not going to solve the aging problem. California is now aging 50% faster than the rest of the country, having historically been a young society. So I would be saying, how do we disperse economic growth so that jobs can be close to where people live, so they don't have to travel as much? How do we restore our industrial situation? Like, what good does it do that we've chased the concrete industry out of California? So now you got to go to Nevada and Arizona to pick up concrete. How is that possibly environmentally good, given that just by nature of climate, it's cheaper to do it and you have to ship it?
So what I'm hearing you say, I'll feed back to you. What I heard you say was that really, again, it goes back to property ownership, that the state needs a rethinking of the ability to have home ownership. And
Exactly.
that is this is one of the big issues facing California, is just that ability of having affordable housing, to be able to climb up the economic ladder.
And what you do is, by having high energy prices, you make living in the interior, which tends to get hotter and colder because, the closer you are to the coast. If you live in Santa Monica, you practically don't need heating or air conditioning. Um,
Right.
and so you're making it more expensive to maintain the house as well. Um, and of course, the great thing about a homeowner is going to be thinking in the long term. They're going to think about their community. They're going to care about their schools. They're going to probably be more likely to participate, and they're not going to be as ideological. They're going to be, they want to protect their investment,
So it's
and so they're going to
more
be
about
more pragmatic.
practical, and they're going to be more interested in how much they're paying in taxes and the rest of it, because that comes with the territory as well.
So take example, compare Texas, which I know very well, and
Right.
California. Hispanics in Texas are much more conservative, much more likely to own a home, much more likely to own a business, much more likely to go to church. So Latinos,
Than Hispanics in California.
oh yeah, Latinos in Texas, about 40-45% have voted for Republicans. Used to be the case in California, by the way, but much less so now. Because if I'm a renter and I'm never going to own a house, and I'm probably never going to start a business, and my life is going to be constrained, why the hell not vote for Bernie Sanders? You tell me why that person shouldn't vote for Bernie. At least Bernie is addressing your issues. By the way, the demand that there be more African Americans at Berkeley or on the board of Google does nothing for the vast majority of African Americans, but it buys the peace for the oligarchs. So the reality is, the more people are dependent on government, the more easy they are to manipulate. And as we've torn away our concern about property ownership, about equal rights, about free speech, we begin to create the basis of something that I think is going to look, in the book I cite them quite a bit, Brave New World, much more like Brave New World in 1984. Technology has just advanced too far for 1984.
Because we've constrained the number of voices that can be heard in mainstream or the largest media outlets.
Exactly. And we are turning our education system into an indoctrination program.
Well, you come back to climate change a bunch in the book, and I found this other quote here about this very same thing. You said that, and this is right toward the end. You said, after all, if the world is on the verge of a global apocalypse and also suffering elevated levels of inequality, how can the luxurious lifestyles of so many of the world's most public green advocates, from Prince Charles and Richard Branson to Leonardo DiCaprio and Al Gore, be acceptable? The environmental left may well turn against the billionaires who lament climate change but fly their private jets to discuss the crisis in places like Davos. So, the way you're framing the climate change debate is very much not about the climate. Instead, it's about class and about who's going to be allowed to even discuss this. And that the DiCaprio, Al Gore example, you're running straight at these guys.
Well, and of course, what clearly happens to some extent. My good friend Jim Hartfield in England, who used to be the head of the Communist Party in Manchester, he's not quite there, but he's very much on the left. He says, look, it's about scarcity. If I own a scarce resource, it's worth more. If we have abundant energy and everybody in America can power their home with natural gas or nuclear power reliably, cheaply, that produces one result. If it's incredibly expensive, then I'm the only one who can get to do these things. Like I always get a kick out of Yahoo, which their news section seems to be run by 12-year-olds who were properly programmed.
Who've been
Uh,
through the orthodoxy school.
right. And what I find amazing is all these in quote hip cool celebrities, and they're on vacations in the Bahamas, and they must be flying on private jets. If I'm really rich and I can afford these things, see, this is part of what's going back. We're going back from mass access to luxuries to limited access for luxuries. We're going to make sure, the Greens are so worried about British working class people getting on airplanes and going to the Spanish coast. Wouldn't it be better if they didn't? Because then when I go to the Spanish coast, there won't be anybody there. So now this is like when we think about suburbs and the between the Bay Area and Lake Tahoe. Wouldn't it be great for the oligarchs if they could go to Lake Tahoe without having to drive through suburbia? God, wouldn't that be wonderful? There'd be no traffic. They wouldn't have to look at ugly housing tracts. But here's the really interesting future, getting towards the end of the
Good.
book. How long are the AOCs of the world? In a funny way, I have a weird admiration for AOC and Bernie, at least being honest enough to say, oh, no, it's not, what Obama did, which was create one of the most unequal, help accelerate the creation of an unequal society. We can't have that. And we can't make the climate agenda serve the needs of a small group of oligarchs. So there's going to be a real conflict over time. I think that there's a friend of mine who builds housing in Silicon Valley said, the oligarchs have the least knowledge of the impact of what they do of any group he's ever worked with in his life. He said the average oil company executive is more sensitive to the needs of their employees and their communities than the tech oligarchs. The tech oligarchs, basically really have very, very little of a social conscience. And frankly, they themselves are wildly, coming from fairly upper class backgrounds themselves. They see themselves, and Thomas Piketty writes about the same thing. They see themselves as better. The guy who goes out and the guy who's an immigrant from Latvia and starts a machine shop and eventually has a machine tool company. That person is kind of déclassé, is sort of a parvenu, somebody who we don't admire. But a Bill Gates, oh God, he's practically been deified for producing consistently crappy software with monopoly profits for a generation.
Well, but that goes back to, I want to go back to that point that we talked about this now several years ago, which was this idea between the digital and the material,
Yes.
The war between the digital and the material, San Francisco versus Houston. So handicap this for me, because right now the oil and gas industry is on its back. I mean, it's just been flattened. It's remarkable. There's just simply no doubt that low-cost oil and gas have saved the American economy and American consumers hundreds of billions of dollars over the last decade or so. And so the oil and gas industry made gasoline and natural gas incredibly cheap for consumers. At the same time, it just went bust. I mean, they saved all this money and then ran themselves out of business because they made it too cheap. So who wins? Handicap this for me. Is it going to be the Texas model? Is it going to be the California model? Or is this going to just be continued part of the balkanization of America? Because it seems to me, in fact, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, his brother lives in Houston, and he said, his wife's a dietitian, and he's working between jobs now, but their house wasn't too expensive, and they can make it in Houston. They can't make it in California. So how do you handicap this new feudalist society that in some ways is already upon us?
Well, I think what here's the scenario I see.
Okay.
I think once Trump is excised, like the tumor that he is, once just because even though I agree with some of his ideas or some of his policies, ideas is probably elevating them too high. But the idea that I think we're going to have a essentially an Obama restoration further to the left. They're going to try to impose, essentially the end of single family home housing. I think that's going to be on the agenda.
More extreme policies on energy.
Right. End of fracking. We can all be like California and get our oil from the very enlightened state of Saudi Arabia. And so what you're going to have is, I think in a funny way, you ought to let these people run things for 2 years. And in 2022, maybe the Republican Party will get its act together and start to come up with a nationalist pro-prosperity program that isn't represented by a person who is such a clearly divisive figure and is clearly tone deaf. I mean, I can see, I've been a lifelong Democrat, but I can see a Jeff, a Hawley, a Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott. I can see myself sort of saying, okay, if I have that kind of Republican,
a moderate, or more centrist Republican,
or even, I would put it in class terms, a party of the third estate, a party of the yeomanry, that I would be happy to join, because I think that the direction that unfortunately the Democratic Party is going in is a feudalist direction. It's a direction of ever greater class divides, more and more control over what you can say, what you can think. I mean,
isn't that remarkable that it's the party that represents itself as the party of the working class? And yet that's the thing that I've struggled with as I look at this, because, I wrote for a liberal newspaper for a dozen years. I've been a Democrat, and I consider my politics very centrist now. But when I look at the Democratic Party, when it comes to these kinds of policies you're talking about, I think especially when it comes to energy, that it's terrible for the poor and the middle class, what they're proposing. And yet that just doesn't seem to occur to them at any time.
And the problem is, in the Democratic Party, people who represent a different tendency are either retired or they can't get anywhere. Jim Webb, for instance. Look, if people say, well, what would you do in Texas? I said, if you ran Henry Cisneros for governor, I'd vote for him.
Right.
I'd probably work for him if I could. I mean, but that kind of person, that Henry Cisneros, Pat Brown,
a working class Democrat.
Right, or a middle class Democrat, a Democrat who doesn't look at a new subdivision outside of Austin as a bad thing. What that means is there's a bunch of people living in homes who are living the life that they worked very hard to achieve.
So let me talk about that, because you mentioned cities before. So, and COVID is on the prowl again, and the numbers are going up, and it's been, depressing, honestly. I mean, really depressing to see how this, we're facing lockdowns again. So forecast that for me. You're a demographer.
Sure.
You've written about these issues for a long time. So what is the future of cities? Are they necessarily going to see more flight? I saw that vacancies in New York are way up, rents are down, same in San Francisco. Is this an end of some of the dominance of the city, and we're going to see more suburbanization? How do you see things happening post-COVID?
Okay, I think there are several things. One, despite the spread of it to states like Texas and California, if you compare it to what's happened in New York in terms of fatalities, you're talking, 100 versus 15,
far less,
1,500. I mean, it's not, because there's a lot of work now on what we call exposure density, that the people who got really sick were people, some of them, they were riding subways. Poverty was a big factor. They were living in multi-generational households with 4 or 5 people.
Right.
They were working in unsanitary conditions, whether in a office building where they're on top of each other, or in a meatpacking plant. These kinds of things sort of increased it. So it's pretty clear that high density housing and crowded urban housing is not good for COVID. Okay, people aren't as stupid as the media thinks they are. The media, first of all, we know that and of course it's never reported, something like 65% reduction in deaths from COVID. Not reported at
Right.
all.
We're talking about the mortality rate. The
Mortality
relative of people dying to those that are infected is way down. Yeah.
way down. So it's running its course, but there will be several things. One, the memory of people who lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan through COVID compared to us who live in houses and have backyards is enormous. If I'm going to live in a disaster, I want to live on my cul-de-sac in Orange County, California, where I've got great neighbors who, when they ran out of flour, the next door neighbor comes over with a big bag of flour and leaves it on the front door for us. I think people are beginning to recognize, as they young people who have moved back with their parents or have moved to rental housing in the suburbs, that this is a far better way to live.
So in some ways, it's a repudiation of this. I mean, it's a reaction to COVID,
right.
but it's also turning out to be in some ways a repudiation of this prescribed density, right? That we're going to tell you, you have to live in dense cities. This is your choice, because we're going to have bike lanes and walkable cities and the rest of it. And you're saying because now of the pandemic that model that has been the kind of the model of city planning now for decades and kind of romanticized about we're going to have the dense city and this is going to be great,
Right.
that may be the bigger undoing than any kind of political
And,
shift,
and the
whatever.
important thing is it was happening before. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, all losing population in the last few years.
And from childbearing area ages, those the 20.
Well, that's
30,
a group that's been leaving the most, but
right. I think that's right. I remember you writing about that.
Growth. Also, if you don't have babies, it sort of reduces your population, right? So I think that what you've got is you had a trend that was already there. I mean, I was able to write the demise of the luxury city before COVID. It was already there. This accelerated. So now people are beginning to look at suburban living, less density. If I'm going to get stuck in a lockdown, and look, this may not be the last one. There could be other pandemics down the road. Where do I want to be when this happens? The probably even more important, the rapid shift, what we're doing right now with Zoom. People are beginning to realize, you know what? I don't have to worry about the fact that I'm not near an airport that takes me to every destination. I did an hour-and-a-half interview with Le Figaro this week in Paris. Now, would I like to go to Paris, where my wife's family's from? Yeah, that would be really nice. But you know what? This works. What we're finding is companies are finding that they're functioning perfectly well, in some ways better. Most telecommuters, when you ask them, well, do you want to go back full-time to the office? They say no. So think about this. Think about Manhattan. You're living in a little apartment. If you're a family, you're living in very high density in the apartment itself. You're getting onto a crowded street. You're getting into a crowded subway. You're getting into a crowded elevator. Now, if we do social distancing, one of the great ironies is the people who will be most fanatical about social distancing are going to be the people who least can get away with it. So they're going to be, what are we going to do? Wait 45 minutes to get into the elevator? We're going to have social distancing on the subways. So basically,
it's going to be really hard. I was in downtown Austin for a meeting about 2 weeks ago, and I got on it was the first time I'd been downtown for a while, and I got on the elevator, and there were 4 places where you had footprints on the elevator. It was an elevator that, during busy times would hold 15 people, and it was a space for 4.
Well, right? And so you can imagine, Austin is much easier to do than Manhattan.
Well, of course.
So you've got that factor. And then I really have to add, and this goes back a little bit to the serf class and also to the alienation of the millennials, is you have social disorder. I mean, do I really want to live in a neighborhood where the next time there's a case of police abuse, even the most gratuitous, like the one that happened with Floyd, that there's going to be a riot? I've got to worry every time that there's going to be a riot and that maybe the local stores are going to be burnt down. I mean, and then of course the whole collapse of the education system, which was in bad shape before and is now happening more rapidly. I'm going to want to go to those places where they're more likely to open the schools, where where there's less chance of infection, and where I can work at home.
And less turmoil.
Right. So the what's one of the this is what I call bluicide, which is that blue states are essentially destroying themselves. Now, I
Because
agree.
now you mentioned that, we talked the other day, and you mentioned that before, but that bluicide, when I hear you say that, it seems to what I hear in my head when you say that is heavily democratic states that are regulating their economies into the ground. Is that
Exactly.
and is that I'm not, I don't want to steal your thunder or take that idea away from you, but that's what I mean. We clearly see it most clearly, I think, in New York and California.
And look at it. If I have, if I look at what's happening here in California, not besides the education itself being crappy, even in my daughter's charter school, which is pretty good, actually very good in some ways, I don't think they did a great job. Now, I know they weren't used to it, but we did it at Chapman, and it seemed to work, decently. But the bottom line is, then you've got indoctrination. You know, when the other day, my daughter's an actress, and I'm watching Stagecoach, which was a great movie, with from
John Ford, is that one
John
of the John
Ford.
Ford movies
Yeah,
with John Wayne, right?
right. My daughter goes, and I said, "Well," I said, "you should watch this movie. This is really good." She said, "Oh, John Wayne was a racist, and therefore she wouldn't watch it." I'm sitting there saying these kids are cutting themselves off. When you get to a point that the kids don't know that U.S. Grant was, and being a Northerner, I'm obviously partial to the Union. U.S. Grant was an anti-slavery person from day one, and was the one who destroyed the Confederacy. Without U.S. Grant, the Confederacy may have existed. So why would we tear down his statue, or why would we sell a version of American history, which many of my left-wing academic friends agree with me on this, that American history is nothing but slavery? That's what I want my kids to learn? That when after all, the vast majority of Americans didn't even get here, their families didn't get here until after slavery. The vast majority of Southerners didn't own slaves. The North, as I recall, won the Civil War, overwhelmingly.
They did, although that's well, let me move on here, because we've been talking more than an hour, Joel, and I want to keep the focus on your book. And by the way, again, the book is The Coming of NeoFeudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. So I'll be honest with you here. Sometimes we talk and I think, damn, that guy Kotkin, he's grumpy. He's just kind of grumpy, and I understand why. And I say that as a joke, but also with a little truth in it, that you are a little grumpy about this. And there's a little bit of anger in how you're looking at this, because what I detect in you is a feeling, or that you're talking or seeing what you see as a betrayal of the poor and the middle class.
That is exactly.
Is that a fair assessment?
And a betrayal of what the purpose of liberalism was supposed to be in the first place, or even
liberalism being open society and equal and open opportunity, and not liberalism as left right, but open liberalism as openness to ideas. The Dutch, from the Dutch in the 1600s, right? They were
right,
not
exactly.
we're not going to let the priests be the arbiters of everything.
And I think that the betrayal of the middle and working class, and particularly the betrayal of the millennials, it bothers me. I have two daughters. I care about them. I care about the world they're growing up in. I'm concerned about my students. I'm concerned about the future of a society in which huge percentage of the population, let's say here in California, according to United Way, somewhere about 30% of Californians barely can pay their bills, about 40% of Latinos, 50% of undocumented Latinos. This is not sustainable. And so, I think that if my old mentor, Mike Harrington, could see what was happening in California, I don't think he'd approve of it.
Well, so then let me try and cast this forward just a little bit, because we've talked about your forecasts and trends away from the city toward more inequality. So, and I'm glad you admit that you're kind of grumpy, because you are kind of grumpy. Mm. So am I sometimes. Mm. But what gives you hope now? I mean, when you look forward, toward the end of the book, and if I was going to have one criticism of the book, is that you don't lay out necessarily anything at the end about, well, what do we do now, right? And
Well,
what are the things that we can do that can help address this? I mean, besides the ballot box, right? But if we can only vote for Democrats who are going to make this problem worse, or Republicans who are Trumpists, that's not a choice. So what are the ways forward?
well, in our new report that just came out on California feudalism, we looked at several things. One, change in energy policy. You just, if you're
This
going to
is
have
fundamental. The
incredibly high
energy lies at the bottom of at the center of the policy making business,
and drives the other things. For instance, there are industries where we in California still have potential, and even existing advantages: space, entertainment, uh, media, medical equipment. But these sectors are being regulated, almost to a point of being impossible. We have the regulation, for instance, AB5 on contract workers. Well, the entertainment industry works completely on contract workers. How do we deal with things like the pandemic? Are there ways that we can not make things harder on smaller businesses? I remember interviewing somebody in East LA, and he's saying to me, "You know what? I own a shoe store. I've been closed for 3 months, but my customers are going to Target and buying shoes. How is that fair? How are we going to help small businesses?" These are critical issues. We need to have an education system. I'm building, drones in Long Beach, California. I don't need somebody with a degree in gender studies. I need somebody who maybe didn't even go to college, but maybe has a degree as in some sort of mechanical art.
So you're arguing, if I can interrupt again, you're arguing for more practical politics.
Exactly.
More practical politics. It's about how does this affect? And I think Phil Graham had an old line about, it was a barber, I think his name was Dickie Flat or something like that. And whenever Phil Graham, who, the old joke about Phil Graham was, where's the most dangerous place to stand between Phil Graham and a TV camera?
Right.
But Graham had this line where he said, well, if I'm looking at a piece of legislation, how does it affect the barber who cuts my hair?
And I think that's,
and so what you're arguing, and that was, like I said, if I was going to critique the book at the end, it was, well, what's the prescription? So if I'm going to put those words in your mouth, it's that we need more practical politicians looking at what is going to affect individual property owners and allow more property ownership. Is that fair?
Exactly. And like, for instance, the VMT policy, which we did that paper on.
Vehicle miles traveled. Yeah.
I mean, you're basically saying you can't build where people can afford to live.
And you're restricted, and it's a mobility tax.
Right. There's no question about that. And then, there are the failed education system, which doesn't teach kids skills. I mean, frankly, you can have all the Black Lives Matter posters you want, but if these kids coming out of schools have no skills, who's going to hire them? I mean, yes, you can hire some loudmouth academic, because you only need one of them, and to buy your political protection. But what about what about the kids with skills? We interviewed a guy in Maryland, who African American guy, went to Harvard, and has an academy for kids who are in danger from the legal system, who may be going to jail, and what they're doing is they're mentoring them. Like, one of the contributors is a guy owns African American guy owns an air conditioning company, and so he goes with it. So they're going to school, but they got an internship. They're being paid. They're learning. Show up at work. I mean, I can tell you, my older daughter works at Home Depot in Arizona, and she says one of the biggest problems is they got large numbers of people. They don't know that they're supposed to show up all the time. People show up late. People, if the learning how to do an interview, learning some basic mathematical skills and English language skills, that's not important anymore to the clerisy. The clerisy, the Roman Catholic
challenge, I guess, if I were gonna, and I want to draw this to a close because it's been a great conversation. I don't want to take your whole day, but you're arguing for more practical politics on the whether it comes from the left or the right. Because I feel somewhat similar. I don't feel like the feel kind of like I don't have a party, but but I'm after more practical politics that are ones that make sense for the poor and the working class, and that's what I'm hearing from you.
Like, and many of the policy prescriptions we look at, we look at who's doing it right. In some cases, it's Texas and Tennessee, but you know what? In terms of worker training, Germany, Austria, Denmark, I've seen it in Denmark firsthand. Their policies are better. They're taking a better approach. Look, the Europeans are opening up their schools. I mean, the idea of keeping the grade schools closed for another year it's like the Red Guards. I remember doing interviews with former Red Guards in China, and they basically didn't go to school for a whole several years. They said they never caught up from that.
Huh.
So
last question, Joel. So look, some of this has been frustrating, and when I look at what's happening, I get frustrated as well. But what gives you hope?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. I think several things. One, I think the fact that Mike Schellenberger's book is a bestseller is telling me something, that there's an appetite out there for a counter narrative. Coming from, by the way, Mike, like you and me, lifelong Democrat, would certainly be seen as more on the left than the right. Second of all, I think that there's in a weird way, Biden's nomination reconfirmed that the vast majority of Democrats, including African Americans, are actually more middle of the road. The fact that there were people like Willie Brown who were saying the Black Lives Matter said, defund the police is the stupidest slogan he's ever heard. I mean, other words, the letter from Harper's. I mean, there is a
letter. I'm sorry, the letter from Harper's. I'm sorry.
Harper's, there were a bunch of liberal intellectuals basically wrote a statement of concern about the control of free speech.
Okay.
So there's beginning to be a counter reaction to some of this stuff. And
that gives you hope.
It gives me hope. I also, when you look at what do young people want, they want a house, they want to have a family, they have those aspirations. The clerisy has not been able to turn everybody into a person of dubious connections to the opposite sex. They don't, the idea that most millennials want to live something like the way their parents did. Okay. Now, I'm totally tolerant. I think people can choose the lifestyle they want. I think most gay people that I know want to buy a house and have some sort of family. So I think that those instincts are very strong, and the PC police cannot eliminate the fact that we're still mammals, and that we still have certain things that we want and need, and that we can't live on ideology or on sort of abstract ideas. So I think that there are elements of hope. The biggest issue is going to be, how do we maintain enough free speech so that the arguments can be engaged? And because I see so often that a doctor says, well, actually we should be doing this about COVID. Oh no, well, the official ideology is you can't do that. Well, maybe the doctor has a point. Right. Why don't we have a debate? If we get to the point, and I'll end with this, with Aldous Huxley, when Huxley said a dictatorship based on technology can never be overthrown. If that dictatorship is put in place, as is happening in China now, then I see very little hope. We have got to see what's happening in China as something that we want to avoid. I think most Americans are still there. I think another 5-10 years of this cultural regime, and we may not be there.
Joel, your book, the coming of NeoFeudalism, Warning to the Global Middle Class. I've read it. It's a remarkable bit of scholarship that pulls together a lot of history, a lot of your demographic work, a lot of your observations over your career. And it's a remarkable book. Your 10th. Congratulations on getting it published. I recommend it to you. It's on Amazon or bn.com, a lot of other outlets. So I'm going to just say to the listeners, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening
Thank you.
to the Power Hungry podcast. Joel, thanks for being with me. A couple of quick details. If you like the podcast, do me a favor, give us a 5, 6, 8-star rating, 10-star. I think you can only give 5, but if you have an option, do it, give us extras. I'm easy to find, robertbryce.com. You can look at our new film, juicethemovie.com. And I'm on Twitter, of course, PWR Hungry, Power Hungry, Juice for All. This has been the Power Hungry podcast. I will look forward to the next one. Stay tuned, y'all.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you.